Some stories find you when you need them most. This one came to me like an old photograph tucked between the pages of a family Bible, faded at the edges, but still carrying warmth. It speaks of a time when folks measured worth by what they built with their hands, not what others whispered behind their backs. A time when second chances were as rare as spring rain in West Texas, and twice as precious. If you've ever felt overlooked, counted out, or written off before your story was finished well, pull up a chair. This tale's for you. The knock came at dusk. Clara Weston pressed her palm flat against the rough-hewn door, feeling the vibration of knuckles against wood travel through pine and into bone. Nobody knocked here. Not anymore. She waited. 3 heartbeats. 4. Another knock slower this time, almost apologetic. Through the gap in the curtain, a man's silhouette, broad shoulders, hat in hand, a horse tied to her cedar post, its breath steaming in the cooling air. She knew him, Daniel Carver, the widower from the failing ranch 6 miles east. She'd seen him at the general store last month, buying seed corn with coins he counted twice. Her fingers found the latch. The hinges groaned. He stood there, dust coating his boots, sweat staining his collar despite the evening chill. His eyes met hers for half a second, then dropped to the hat he was crushing between calloused fingers. "Mrs. Weston." His voice scraped like a wagon wheel on dry axle. "I got a proposition, and I ain't proud of it. If this opening stirred something in you, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, as my grandmother used to say. A story shared is a burden halved. Drop a comment below. Your neighbors might just be listening too." Clara's grip tightened on the doorframe. The wood bit into her palm a splinter. Maybe, or just the cold. "Proposition," she repeated. The word sat strange on her tongue, like something borrowed. Daniel Carver shifted his weight from one boot to the other. Behind him, his horse stamped once, twice, then went still. "My ranch is dying." He said it flat, the way a man says the sky is blue. 3 seasons of bad luck, banks giving me one more harvest before they take the land. I need... He stopped, swallowed. "I need someone, not for..." His jaw worked sideways. "Not for what a man usually needs a wife for." The evening air carried the smell of sage and dust. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked 3 sharp yips. Then silence. "You're asking me to marry you. I'm asking you to work alongside me, share the load. I got a roof that don't leak and food enough for 2. His eyes finally lifted to hers. Pale blue, red-rimmed from wind or sleeplessness or both. "I ain't got love to offer. Lost that when I lost Margaret. But I got honesty, and I won't never lie to you about what this is." Clara's fingers released the doorframe. She crossed her arms over her chest, feeling the thin cotton of her dress washed so many times the flowers had faded to ghosts. Why me? The question came out harder than she intended. "You know what folks say about why Henry and I never..." "I know what folks say." Daniel cut her off. Not unkind. "I also know folks say plenty that ain't worth the breath it takes to speak it." The kerosene lamp behind her flickered. A moth tapped against the window glass. Desperate and stupid, she thought of the empty pantry, the $3.40 hidden beneath the loose floorboard, the way Mrs. Harmon had looked through her at the general store last Tuesday, like Clara was made of creek water. "When?" she heard herself ask. "Circuit preacher comes through Thursday, if you're willing." Thursday. 4 days. 4 days to pack a life that fit in one trunk. 4 days to leave behind a cabin where the walls still held the shape of her shame. I got one condition, Clara said. Daniel waited. I won't be mocked in my own home. Not by you. Not by anyone you let through the door. You can promise me that. His answer came without hesitation. Ain't nobody gonna mock you under my roof. The moth stopped tapping. Clara opened the door wider. The rooster crowed before first light. Clara's eyes opened to an unfamiliar ceiling, rough-hewn beams, a water stain shaped like a bent spoon. Cobwebs in the corner where wall met roof for 3 heartbeats. She forgot where she was. Then the smell of dust and old wood and something faintly animal brought it back. Daniel Carver's ranch. Her home now. If a word like home could stretch far enough to cover this. She pushed back the quilt, not hers. Probably Margaret's. Probably sewn by hands now buried in the small cemetery she'd glimpsed from the wagon and set her feet on the cold plank floor. Her trunk sat unopened in the corner. She'd unpacked only the essentials, her mother's recipe book, her hairbrush, the cotton nightgown she wore now. The rest could wait. The rest could wait forever. For all she cared, through the small window, the sky held that particular gray that came before dawn, not light yet, but the promise of it. Clara found her dress on the chair where she'd folded it, stepped into her worn boots without lacing them, and opened the door to the main room. The cook stove was cold. No fire had been lit. She could see through the front window that the barn door stood open. Daniel already at work. Then, before the sun had even bothered to rise, Clara crossed to the stove. A blue enamel coffee pot sat on the iron surface, empty. She found the coffee tin on the shelf above, ground beans in a small hand-cranked mill, filled the pot with water from the bucket by the door. The matches were in a tin box with a faded label she couldn't read in the dim light. Strike, hiss, the smell of sulfur, then the steadier smell of burning kindling. By the time the coffee boiled, gray light had crept through every window. Clara poured a cup for herself tin, dented on one side, and stood at the back door, looking out at what was now, legally, half hers. The land stretched flat and brown toward a line of scrub oaks in the distance. Closer, a chicken coop with wire mesh patched in 3 places, a vegetable garden gone to seed, a fence that sagged between every other post, like a man too tired to stand straight. She drank her coffee in slow sips. It was bitter. She hadn't put in enough grounds. The chickens needed feeding. She found the feed bin in the small shed attached to the coop, filled a rusted can, and scattered grain across the packed dirt. 6 hens emerged from the coop, red and brown, and 1 speckled white pecking at the ground with mechanical precision. "Ain't much," Clara said to them. Her voice sounded strange in the morning quiet. "But it's something." The white hen looked up at her, head cocked sideways, then returned to eating. Clara spent the morning walking the property. She counted fence posts that needed replacing 14. She noted the well pump's handle, which stuck on the upstroke. She found a pile of rotted lumber behind the barn that might have been a second shed once. Years ago, she discovered a root cellar with the door that hung crooked on its hinges, the darkness inside smelling of damp earth and old potatoes. By midday, her boots were gray with dust, and her hands were dirty from testing soil near the empty garden beds. She was kneeling in the dirt, pressing her palm flat against the ground to feel its moisture, when Daniel's shadow fell across her. "Ground's harder than it looks." His voice came from somewhere above and behind her. "You'll need gloves." Clara didn't turn. "Hands heal. Ground don't wait." She heard him shift his weight, the creak of leather, a long exhale through his nose. "Stubborn woman," he said. Quiet, not mean, almost like he was just trying out the words, seeing how they fit. Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a handful of seedlings, tomato starts she'd dug up from her old garden before leaving, their roots wrapped in damp cloth, their leaves wilted but still green. "You brought those?" Daniel asked. "My pa used to say strange land needs familiar plants, until the dirt learns to trust what's growing in it." She pressed the first seedling into a small hole she'd made with her fingers. The soil crumbled, dry and resistant. She pressed harder. The roots went in. Daniel watched for a moment longer, then walked away. She heard his boots on the hard ground, the barn door creaking open. Then nothing. The afternoon passed in small tasks. Clara swept the main room. She scrubbed the cook stove until the black iron showed through the grease. She found a mending basket under a chair and discovered 3 shirts with torn seams, 2 pairs of trousers with holes in the knees, a sock worn through at the heel. Someone had started these repairs and stopped. Margaret. Probably. Before whatever had taken her had taken her. Clara threaded a needle and began to sew. Supper was beans from a jar and cornbread she made from the supplies in the pantry cornmeal, salt, a tin of lard, buttermilk that was still good. She and Daniel ate at the small table near the window, the kerosene lamp between them casting shadows that jumped when the flame flickered. Neither spoke. Daniel finished first. He pushed back his chair, nodded once, not quite thanks, but something close, and went outside, through the window. Clara watched him cross to the barn. He disappeared inside for that several minutes, then emerged carrying a burlap sack and a square of cloth. He sat on the porch steps. She couldn't see what he was doing, but his shoulders were hunched, his head bowed. After a while, he stopped moving entirely, just sat there, still as stone, staring at something in his hands. Clara washed the dishes, dried them, put them back on the shelf where she'd found them. When she looked out the window again, Daniel hadn't moved. She poured coffee into a tin cup, carried it outside, set it on the step beside him without looking at what held his attention. Then she went back inside, closed the door, and returned to her mending. An hour later, the coffee cup sat where she'd left it, untouched and cold. The lamp was burning low when Daniel finally came inside. His face was the color of old ash. He didn't look at her, just crossed to the corner where his bedroll lay, sat down heavily on the edge of it, and began pulling off his boots. "Everything all right?" Clara asked, even though she knew better than to ask. Daniel's hands stopped. One boot on, one boot off. He stared at the floor for a long moment. "Seed corn," he said. "Tested it this evening. Wrapped a handful in wet cloth. Same as my father taught me." Clara waited. Less than half showed life. His voice was flat, emptied of everything. "The rest is dead. Won't sprout. Won't grow. 3 seasons of bad seed, and I've been too blind to check until now." The lamp flame guttered. Clara's needle hovered above the shirt in her lap. "How much seed you got left?" Daniel looked up at her. In his eyes, she saw the answer before he spoke it. "Enough for 1 planting. Maybe." He dropped his boot to the floor. "And if this batch don't take, I got nothing left to try again." The planting began on a Tuesday, when the soil was still damp from a brief rain that had come and gone in the night. Daniel showed Clara how to walk the rows 3 steps between each drop. 2 seeds per hole, cover with the heel of her boot. The rhythm of it settled into her bones by mid-morning. Step, drop, cover, step, drop, cover. The burlap seed bag hung heavy against her hip, growing lighter with each pass across the field. They worked in silence, Daniel 50 yards ahead, breaking ground with the hand plow while Clara followed with the seed. The sun climbed, sweat gathered at the small of her back, soaking through her dress until the cotton clung to her skin. Her shoulders ached, her fingers, stained brown from handling seed, cramped around the bag's rough fabric. By noon, they had finished 3 rows. Daniel stopped at the fence line, pulled a canteen from where it hung on a post, and drank. Clara walked toward him, her legs heavy, her throat dry as the dust that coated her boots. He held out the canteen without speaking. She took it. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but she drank until her stomach sloshed. "You learn quick," Daniel said. Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Ain't complicated, just tedious." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but close. He took back the canteen, hung it on the post, and returned to the plow. The days found a pattern. Up before dawn, coffee and cold biscuits, work until the sun drove them inside, rest during the hottest hours, then back to the fields until the light failed. Supper, silence, sleep. Clara discovered that Daniel played the harmonica. She heard it the 3rd night, drifting from the porch while she washed dishes, a slow tune. Mournful, the notes bending in ways that made her chest tight. She didn't ask about it. Some things weren't meant to be asked about. On the 7th evening, Daniel lingered at the supper table. His plate was clean, his coffee cup empty. But he didn't rise. His eyes rested on the small book Clara had propped against the sugar bowl, her mother's recipe book, the leather cover soft with age, the pages swollen from years of kitchen steam. "That belonged to your ma?" Clara's hand paused over the wash basin. "Yes." "She teach you to cook from it?" "Some. Mostly biscuits and cornbread. The hard stuff I learned on my own after she passed." Daniel nodded. His thumb traced the edge of the table, following a groove worn into the wood by years of plates and elbows and spilled coffee. "How old were you?" 14. Clara scrubbed at a stubborn spot on the skillet. "Fever took her in the spring. Same one that took half the county that year. I remember that spring." Daniel's voice dropped lower. "Took my cousin's youngest. Boy was only 6. The skillet was clean. Clara kept scrubbing anyway. "Margaret passed in the spring too," Daniel said. The words came slow, like he was pulling them up from deep water. "Birthing our boy. Boy didn't make it neither." Clara's hands went still in the basin. 6 years ago." Daniel stared at the table. "Ain't talked about it since. Ain't wanted to." The lamp flame flickered between them. Clara set down the skillet, dried her hands on her apron, and poured more coffee into Daniel's cup without asking if he wanted it. He wrapped his fingers around the tin, holding it but not drinking. "I'm sorry," Clara said, because what else was there to say? Daniel lifted the cup, drank, set it down. "Reckon we both got our ghosts." The next morning, they finished planting the last field. Daniel walked the rows at dusk, checking depth and spacing, his lips moving silently as he counted. Clara watched from the porch, her mending basket in her lap, a needle threaded but idle in her fingers. They needed supplies. The cornmeal was low, the coffee nearly gone, and Clara had found mouse droppings in the flour barrel. Daniel hitched the wagon before breakfast, and they rode toward town in the early light, the wheels rattling over ruts baked hard by the sun. Copper Creek wasn't much a single main street with a general store, a feed shop, a blacksmith, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly east. A few houses clustered behind the businesses, their windows dark despite the morning hour. Daniel pulled the wagon up to the feed store first. Clara climbed down from the seat and stood near the open doorway while he went inside. The morning was already warm, and the smell of grain and leather drifted out into the street. She heard them before she saw them, two women, emerging from the general store with baskets over their arms. Mrs. Harmon, the one who'd whispered at the wedding, and another woman Clara didn't recognize. They stopped walking. Mrs. Harmon leaned toward her companion, her mouth moving rapidly, her eyes cutting toward the wagon. The other woman pressed her hand to her chest. Eyebrows rising, both of them stared. Clara didn't move, didn't blink. She looked at the hitching post and counted the cracks in the wood. Inside the feed store, she could hear Daniel's voice, low and even, discussing prices. Then another voice, older, rougher, carrying the particular weight of a man who believed his opinions mattered more than most. "Carver, heard you went and got yourself hitched." "I did. To the Weston widow." A pause. "The Barren one." Clara's fingers curled into her palms. "Doc Hensley's wife used to say that gal was cursed." The old man's voice carried easily through the open door. "Couldn't give her first husband children. And look what happened to him, dead before 30. Some folks got bad luck that sticks to 'em like tar." Silence from inside. Clara's nails dug crescents into her skin. Then Daniel's voice, flat and hard. "You got my seed order ready, Emmett? Or you just here to flap your jaw?" "Now hold on, I was just saying." "I heard what you was saying. I ain't interested." The sound of coins hitting a counter. "Bag of chicken feed, 20 pounds of oats, put it on my account." Clara released her breath. Her hands uncurled, leaving red marks on her palms. Daniel emerged from the feed store with a sack over each shoulder. His face was the color of a closed door, unreadable. Shut tight, he loaded the sacks into the wagon bed, climbed onto the seat beside Clara, and took up the reins. They didn't stop at the general store. Daniel turned the wagon around and headed back the way they'd come, the wheels kicking up dust that hung in the still air. A mile out of town, he spoke. "That Dawson fella always did talk more than he thinks." Clara watched the road ahead. The fields stretched flat and brown on either side, interrupted only by the occasional scrub oak. A hawk circled high above, lazy and patient. "Most folks do," she said. "Ain't that the truth?" They rode in silence for another mile. Clara's hands had stopped shaking. She hadn't realized they had been shaking until they stopped. "Henry died of fever." The words came out of her before she could stop them. 2 years after we married, I nursed him for 3 weeks before he went. Fed him broth with a spoon when he couldn't lift his head. Changed his sheets when the sweats came. Held his hand at the end." Daniel didn't look at her. "Wasn't nothing cursed about it. Just sickness. Just bad luck. But folks needed a reason, and I was the easiest one to blame." The wagon wheels creaked. The horses' hooves struck the hard, packed road in a steady rhythm. "I know," Daniel said. Clara turned to look at him. His jaw was set, his eyes forward, his hands steady on the reins. "What do you know?" "I know you ain't cursed. I know you ain't Barren neither. Whatever that old fool thinks he knows." He shifted the reins to one hand, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Found this in the feed store." Emmett's boy was handing them out. He passed the paper to Clara. She unfolded it. A notice, printed in smeared ink. Circuit Preacher Reverend Samuel Whitmore to hold revival meeting. Subject: The curse of the barren woman and God's judgment upon her. Clara's stomach turned to stone. The first green shoots appeared on a Sunday morning. Clara saw them when she walked to the chicken coop, thin pale spears pushing up through dark soil. Fragile as eyelashes, bent slightly toward the rising sun. She stopped at the edge of the field and stared. Her chest did something strange, a loosening she didn't recognize at first. "They're up." Daniel's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. "I see that." They stood side by side, looking at the field, not touching, not speaking. Just looking at the proof that something they'd planted together had decided to live. The days that followed moved differently. Clara noticed it in small ways: the set of Daniel's shoulders when he came in for supper, the way he no longer stared at the floor when she asked about the fields. The worry lines between his eyes didn't disappear, but they softened. Sometimes he almost looked like a man who remembered how to hope. She noticed other things, too. The shirts she'd mended now hung in the wardrobe instead of piled on the chair. The sock with the patched heel appeared on his foot at breakfast. He'd found the stack of folded laundry she'd left on his bedroll and put everything away without comment. On Sunday, neither of them mentioned church. Clara had expected it, had prepared herself for the awkward suggestion, the careful refusal, but Daniel simply rose, ate his breakfast, and went out to check on the livestock as if Sunday were any other day. Clara watched him through the window, then turned back to the empty room. Her mother's Bible sat on the shelf beside the recipe book. Clara hadn't touched it since arriving. Now she lifted it down, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the leather cover cracked and soft from years of handling. She opened it to Psalms and began to read aloud, her voice filling the quiet room. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." She read until the sun climbed high enough to warm the floorboards beneath her feet. When she finished, she closed the Bible and set it back on the shelf. Her throat was dry, her eyes stung from something that wasn't dust. The trouble started 3 days later. One of the cows, the spotted one Daniel called Patch, gave birth in the night. Clara heard the commotion from her bed, the low bellowing and stamping that meant something had gone wrong. By the time she pulled on her boots and ran to the barn, Daniel was already there, lantern held high, his face grim in the yellow light. The calfie lay in the straw, wet and unmoving. Patch stood in the far corner of the stall, her eyes rolling white, her body pressed against the wooden slats as if trying to escape. "She won't go near it," Daniel said. "Some mothers don't take to their young. Nothing to be done." Clara knelt beside the calf. Its ribs moved barely, but they moved. She pressed her hand against its side and felt the flutter of a heartbeat, weak and fast. "It's alive. Won't be for long, not without its mother." Clara looked at the calf, then at Daniel, then back at the calf. "You got any milk from the other cow?" Daniel's eyebrows rose. "Some. In the spring house. And clean rags. Something I can twist into a nipple." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he set down the lantern and went to get what she'd asked for. The first night was the hardest. The calf wouldn't suck. Clara dipped the rag nipple in milk and pressed it against the animal's lips, squeezed drops onto its tongue, wiped away the liquid that dribbled down its chin. Her back ached from bending. Her eyes burned from the smoke of the lantern. The straw poked through her dress and scratched her knees raw. Sometime past midnight, the calf swallowed. Clara kept feeding it, drop by drop, until the milk was gone. Then she sat back against the stall wall, the calf's head heavy in her lap, and watched the lantern flame gutter in its glass chimney. She must have slept. When she opened her eyes, gray light was seeping through the cracks in the barn walls, and a rough wool blanket lay draped over her shoulders. Daniel stood in the doorway, a tin cup steaming in his hand. "You didn't have to do this," he said. Clara's neck was stiff. Her dress was damp with milk and other things she didn't want to name. Straw clung to her hair, her sleeves, the folds of her skirt. "Neither did you," she said, touching the blanket. The calf stirred in her lap. Its eyes opened large and brown and unfocused, and it let out a sound, a weak bleat that was more breath than voice. Daniel crossed the barn and held out the cup. Clara took it. The coffee was hot and strong, and it burned going down in the best possible way. "Stubborn little critter," Daniel said, looking at the calf. "Takes one to know one, I reckon." His eyes lifted to hers. "You callin' me stubborn? I'm callin' you still here?" Clara took another sip of coffee. "That's something." The second night was easier. The calf had learned to suck, pulling at the rag nipple with growing strength. Clara fed it every 2 hours, setting the old clock by her bed to wake her, stumbling out to the barn in the dark with a jar of milk warming against her chest. Daniel came out at midnight with more coffee. He didn't speak, just sat on an overturned bucket and watched while Clara fed the calf. His hands loose between his knees, his face soft in the lantern light. The third night, she woke to find him already in the barn, the calf's head in his lap, a fresh rag nipple in his hand. "Figured you could use the sleep," he said without looking up. Clara leaned against the stall door and watched him feed the animal she'd fought to keep alive. His hands were rough, calloused, too big for the delicate work, but he held the rag nipple steady, and the calf drank. On the fourth morning, the calf stood. Its legs trembled, its knees buckled once, twice, 3 times, but it stood, swaying like a drunk on Saturday night, its tail twitching, its wet nose pressed against Clara's palm. "Well," Daniel said from behind her, "look at that." Clara scratched the calf behind its ears. It pushed against her hand, demanding more. "She's gonna need a name. She checked this morning, heifer." Clara considered. The calf blinked up at her with those large brown eyes, still wobbly, still weak but standing. "Hope," Clara said. "Her name's Hope." Daniel didn't laugh, didn't roll his eyes or make a comment about sentiment. He just nodded, once, and went to get more milk. That evening, after supper, Clara stood at the kitchen window washing the last of the dishes. The sun had set, and the sky was that particular shade of purple that came before full dark. Through the glass, she could see Daniel on the porch, sitting on the top step, his back to the house. Then she heard it, the harmonica, low and slow, the notes drifting through the open door and into the kitchen, where she stood with wet hands and a dish towel over her shoulder, a song she recognized from somewhere deep, mournful, but not hopeless. The kind of tune that acknowledged hard times without surrendering to them. Clara dried her hands, set down the towel, walked to the doorway and stood there, neither inside nor out, listening. Daniel didn't turn around, but he didn't stop playing either. The song ended. The last note hung in the air, then faded into the chirp of crickets, and the distant call of a whippoorwill. "Margaret used to love that one," Daniel said quietly. "Ain't played it since she passed." Clara's hand found the doorframe. Her heart beat against her ribs, steady and strong. "It's beautiful," she said. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to play again the same song, or maybe a different one. She couldn't tell any more. Clara stayed in the doorway, listening, until the stars came out and the night wrapped itself around the little ranch like a blanket. She didn't close the door, neither did he. But in the morning, when Clara walked out to check on Hope, she found the calf standing beside its mother. Patch's head was lowered, her rough tongue running over the calf's back, cleaning it, claiming it. Something had changed in the night, and as Clara stood watching the cow accept the calf she'd rejected, she couldn't help wondering if an animal could change its mind about what it was willing to love. Couldn't a person do the same? The heat came without warning. One day the sky held clouds. The next, it stretched white and empty from horizon to horizon, bleached clean of everything but the sun. Clara felt the change before she understood it, a tightness in the air, a dryness that crept into her throat and settled there like dust. By the end of the first week, the creek had dropped 6 inches. By the end of the second, it ran thin and sluggish over rocks that had been underwater since spring. The corn, their corn. The corn they'd planted seed by seed with aching backs and blistered hands began to curl at the edges. The leaves, once broad and green, twisted inward on themselves like fists. Daniel stopped sleeping. Clara heard him rise before dawn, heard the creak of the back door, the clank of the bucket against the well housing. She would lie in her narrow bed and listen to the rhythm of his work pump. Pour, carry, pump, pour, carry. Hour after hour, bucket after bucket, trying to keep alive what the sun was determined to kill. She did what she could. She dug irrigation ditches with a hand spade, cutting shallow trenches from the well to the garden, lining them with flat stones to slow the water's escape into thirsty soil. She covered the tomato plants with cheesecloth to shade them from the worst of the afternoon glare. She moved what vegetables she could salvage into the root cellar, where the earth stayed cool and damp. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. The corn yellowed. The bean vines withered on their poles. The sunflowers that had pushed up along the fence line drooped their heavy heads, too weak to face the sky that was killing them at supper. Daniel ate in silence. His face had gone gaunt, the bones showing sharp beneath skin darkened by sun and coated with red dust. His hands were wrapped around his coffee cup, trembled with exhaustion. "You need to rest," Clara said on the 15th day. "Can't." He didn't look at her. "Every hour I ain't watering, something else dies. You keep this up. You're gonna be the one that dies." His head came up. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red, hollowed out by too many sleepless nights. "Then at least I'll have tried." Clara set down her fork. "That ain't—" "I said I can't." His voice cracked like a whip. "You think I don't know how bad it is? You think I ain't out there every day watching my father's land turn to dust?" He shoved back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the floor. "This is all I got. All I ever had. And it's dying. And there ain't nothing I can do to stop it." The words hung in the air between them. Clara's hands lay flat on the table, motionless. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name. Daniel's face changed. The anger drained out of it, leaving something worse behind, shame. Raw and naked, spreading across his features like a stain. "Clara!" His voice came out rough. I didn't mean, I know, I ain't mad at you. I ain't never been mad at you. I know that too. He stood there, swaying slightly. A man held upright by nothing but stubbornness and pride. Then he turned and walked out the door, letting it bang shut behind him. Clara sat at the table until the lamp burned low. She washed the dishes, dried them, put them away. Through the window, she could see Daniel's silhouette moving between the rows, bucket in hand, pouring water onto ground that swallowed it without a trace. The moon rose. The stars came out. Still he worked. Clara went to bed but didn't sleep. She lay on top of the quilt, too hot for covers, and stared at the ceiling while the heat pressed down on her like a hand. The air was thick, motionless, carrying the smell of dry earth and dying plants. Sometime past midnight, she heard him come inside. His footsteps crossed the main room, slow and heavy. The creak of his bedroll, then silence. She thought about going to him. She thought about saying something, anything that might ease the weight he was carrying. But what words were there for this? What comfort could she offer a man watching his life's work turn to ash? She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes. The morning brought no relief. The sun rose red and angry, promising another day of relentless heat. Clara made coffee and biscuits, but Daniel was already gone by the time she carried breakfast to the porch. She found him in the east field, standing at the edge of a row of corn that had given up the fight in the night. The stalks lay flat against the ground, their roots too shallow to hold them upright, their leaves brown and brittle as old paper. He didn't turn when she approached, just stood there, staring at the ruin. "Whole row's gone," he said. "The one we planted first, the one that came up strongest." Clara looked at the dead corn, at the cracked earth beneath it, at the endless blue sky above, empty of clouds, empty of mercy. "There's still the north field," she said. "The soil holds water better there. We could—" "Could what?" Daniel's voice was flat, defeated. "Save 10 rows out of 100, harvest enough to feed the chickens, but not pay the bank." He sank to his knees, not slowly, not deliberately, just sank, as if his legs had simply given out. His hands pressed flat against the dry ground, fingers spread, digging into dirt that crumbled like ash. Clara watched him. The slope of his shoulders, the way his head hung low, his chin nearly touching his chest. He looked like a man praying. But she knew he wasn't. He'd told her once that he'd stopped talking to the Almighty the day Margaret died. Whatever was happening inside him now, it wasn't prayer. She walked toward him. The dead corn stalks crackled under her boots, dry and hollow, collapsing at the slightest pressure. She stopped beside him and looked down at his hands, at the dust coating his skin, at the cracks in his knuckles where the heat had split them open. Then she knelt. The ground was hard against her knees, still holding the warmth of the day, even as the sun sank toward the horizon. She could smell dust and sweat and something else, the sharp, sour smell of fear, of failure, of a man coming apart at the seams. She placed her hand on top of his. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. The sun dropped lower, painting the sky red and orange and purple, throwing long shadows across the dying field. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out a harsh, lonely sound that echoed across the empty land. Clara's hand stayed where it was. Daniel's breathing slowed. The trembling in his shoulders eased, just slightly. The sun set. The first stars appeared. Still they knelt there. 2 people in the middle of a ruined field, holding on to each other because there was nothing else left to hold. When they finally rose, the night had turned cool. Daniel's face was wet, though Clara pretended not to notice. He wiped his cheeks with the back of his hand and turned toward the house without speaking. Clara followed. At the door, he stopped. His hand rested on the frame, his back still turned to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what I said earlier, for all of it." Clara moved past him into the house. "You got nothing to be sorry for. I yelled at you. You yelled at the sky. I just happened to be standing in front of it." Something that might have been a laugh escaped him dry, broken, but real. He followed her inside and closed the door. That night, Clara sat on the porch alone while Daniel slept. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of sage from the hills beyond the property line. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. She wasn't crying. She'd told herself she wasn't going to cry. Not about this, not about anything. But her cheeks were wet, and her chest ached. And when she heard the door open behind her, she didn't bother to hide it. Daniel sat down beside her, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak. "For what?" "For crying." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "I know it don't help nothing. Neither does not crying." She looked at him. His face was pale in the starlight, his eyes dark and unreadable. "It ain't about the fields," she said. "I mean, it is, but it ain't. Then what is it about?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap. The words came hard, dragging themselves up from somewhere deep. "I ain't never had nothing worth losing before. And now," her voice cracked, "now I do. And it scares me more than the drought ever could." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand in his rough palm, against rough palm. Calluses meeting calluses. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly what you mean." They sat there until the moon rose, hands clasped, saying nothing. And when Clara finally went inside to sleep, she left the door open behind her, just in case. The bank sat at the corner of Main and First, a squat brick building with bars on the windows and a brass sign that had gone green with age. Daniel tied the horse to the rail outside and stood on the boardwalk, his hat crushed between his hands, staring at the door like it might swallow him whole. Clara waited in the wagon. He'd asked her to come inside. She'd shaken her head. Some humiliations a man needed to face alone, and some a wife didn't need to witness. Through the window, she watched his silhouette, saw him stand before the desk where Mr. Patterson shuffled papers, saw his shoulders drop when the banker spoke, saw them drop again. By the time the door opened and Daniel emerged, he looked like a man who'd had the bones pulled out of him. He climbed onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, said nothing. "How bad?" Clara asked. "One more season." His voice came out flat, scraped clean of everything. "Harvest comes in short. He takes the land, house, barn, everything." The horse stamped, impatient. Daniel didn't move. We can't." He cut her off, but there was no anger in it, just emptiness. "The corn's dead. More than half of it. What's left won't cover the debt. Not even close." He stared at the reins in his hands. "I've lost it. Clara, my father's land, everything he built, everything I was supposed to protect." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to reach for him, but his body had gone rigid, closed off. A door slammed shut against comfort. The ride home was silent. The sun beat down on them, relentless, and the dust rose in clouds behind the wagon wheels. When they reached the ranch, Daniel unhitched the horse and led it to the trough without speaking. Then he walked into the fields. Clara watched him go, watched him stop at the edge of the ruined corn, looking out over rows of brown and yellow where green should have been. Then she went inside to start supper, because that was what you did when the world was ending. You kept moving. She was peeling potatoes when she heard the sound, a low, strangled noise, like an animal caught in a trap. Clara set down the knife and crossed to the window. Daniel stood in the middle of the dead field, his back to the house. As she watched, he sank to his knees, not slowly, not gracefully. He dropped, like a puppet with cut strings, and his hands went flat against the ground. His shoulders heaved. She couldn't see his face, but she could imagine it, the twist of grief, the hot shame of failure, the collapse of everything he'd believed himself to be. Something cracked inside her chest. She remembered another day, another floor, another pair of hands pressed flat against cold wood. 8 years ago, Henry's bedroom. 2 weeks after they buried him, the letter she'd found tucked in his Bible, the one he'd written to his mother, the words that had burned through her like fever and left nothing but ash. Barren as a stone, a burden and a shame. I pray for deliverance. She had knelt exactly like Daniel was kneeling now, had felt exactly what he was feeling, that bottomless despair, that crushing weight of worthlessness, and she had carried it alone, because there was no one to share it with, no one who would understand, no one who would look at her and say the words she needed to hear. Clara left the window. Her feet carried her out the back door, across the yard, into the field. The dead corn stalks crackled under her boots. The smell of dust and decay filled her nose. She walked until she reached him, until she stood close enough to see the dirt caked in the creases of his palms, the tremor in his fingers, the wet tracks cutting through the bat on his cheeks. She knelt beside him. The ground was hard and hot, the stubble of dead plants poking through her dress, her knees pressed into soil that crumbled like ash. She could feel the heat radiating up from the earth, feel the grit working its way into the fabric, feel the sweat trickling down her spine. Neither of them spoke. Then Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her mother's recipe book. She'd grabbed it without thinking, carried it with her like a talisman, not knowing why. Between the pages, pressed flat and soft from years of handling, lay a single sheet of paper. My first husband wrote this. Her voice came out steady, though her hands shook as she held it out. To his mother. I found it after he died, tucked in his Bible like a bookmark. Daniel looked at the paper, at her, at the paper again. He took it, unfolded it. The handwriting was cramped and slanted. The ink faded to brown. Clara didn't need to read the words. She knew them by heart. Barren as a stone, cannot fulfill the one duty God gave her. I pray every night for deliverance. Perhaps the Lord will take her. Daniel's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. His eyes moved across the page, and with each line, something in his face changed. Not softening, exactly, but hardening in a different direction, hardening against the man who had written those words. He wrote that 6 months before the fever took him. Clara stared at the ground between her knees. I nursed him for 3 weeks, held the cup to his lips, wiped the sweat from his brow, and the whole time, I didn't know he'd been praying for me to die. Daniel set the letter down on the cracked earth between them. His hand shook. I should have burned it, Clara said. Should have let it go, but I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I deserved to carry it. Maybe I thought if I looked at it enough, it would stop hurting. The wind picked up, stirring the dead corn stalks, sending a scatter of dust across the paper. Daniel pressed his palm flat on top of it, holding it in place. "He was wrong," Daniel said. 3 words. Clara's throat closed around them. "He was wrong about you." Daniel picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and handed it back to her. "And that doctor was wrong, too. Ain't no man can look at a woman and know what she can or can't do. Ain't no piece of paper that tells the truth about a person." Clara's fingers closed around the letter. The paper was warm from his hand. "My pa grew up in hill country." The words came out before she could stop them. "Drier than here, harder soil. He tried corn for years, and it failed every time. Nearly lost everything." Daniel's head came up. What did he do? Switched to sorghum. Clara tucked the letter back into the recipe book. "Needs less water, tougher roots." He kept records for 10 years, what worked, what didn't. How much rain each season. She pulled a smaller notebook from between the pages, leather-bound and worn soft from handling. "It's all in here, his notes, his methods, everything." Daniel took the notebook, opened it. Pages of cramped handwriting, numbers and columns, diagrams of planting depths and spacing. "This could work," he said slowly. "If we could get seed in time. Miller's Cross has a seed merchant. I remember my pa trading there when I was a girl." Clara stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "It's 2 days' ride, maybe 3. We ain't got money for new seed. I got $3.40 hidden under the floorboard in my old cabin." Clara held out her hand. "And I reckon that wedding ring you gave me might fetch something. If we're desperate enough." Daniel stared at her hand, at the thin gold band on her finger. "You'd sell your ring. It ain't the ring that makes a marriage." Clara pulled him to his feet. "It's the choice to stay when leaving would be easier." Daniel stood there in the dying field, dirt coating his hands, dirt streaking his face, his father's land crumbling around him. The sun had set. The first stars were showing through the purple sky. "I'll ride to Miller's Cross tomorrow," Clara said. "If the seed merchant's still there, I'll bring back enough sorghum to plant the north field. That field's smaller. Soil's different. Soil's better, holds water longer." Clara met his eyes. If it takes, we might save this place." "Might?" Clara nodded. "Ain't no guarantees. Never has been." Daniel looked at the notebook in his hands, at Clara, at the field, stretching dark around them. "Your pa," he said. "He ever make it work, the sorghum?" Clara's answer came quiet and steady. "He died believing it would, and he wasn't a fool." The wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called one long, lonely note that hung in the air and faded to nothing. "All right," Daniel said. "We try sorghum." Clara turned toward the house. She had taken 3 steps when Daniel's voice stopped her. "Clara." She looked back. "That letter. The one your husband wrote." Daniel stood where she'd left him, a dark shape against the darkening sky. "You should burn it now, tonight, before you go." Clara's hand found the recipe book in her apron. The letter pressed against her fingers, soft and worn, carrying the weight of 8 years of shame. "I will," she said. But when she reached the house, she didn't light a fire. She stood at the stove, the letter in her palm, and found that she couldn't do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, she tucked it back between the pages and set the book on the shelf. Some things, she'd learned, needed to be kept. Not because they were true, but because they reminded you how far you'd come from believing them. The next morning, she saddled Daniel's horse and rode west toward Miller's Cross. The notebook pressed against her chest, $3.40 in her pocket, and one question she couldn't stop asking herself. What if her father had been wrong? The sorghum seed arrived on a Wednesday, packed in burlap sacks that smelled of dust and distant places. Clara had ridden 3 days to Miller's Cross and 3 days back, sleeping in barns when farmers would have her and under open sky when they wouldn't. She'd eaten hardtack and dried beef, drunk from streams when her canteen ran dry, and kept her father's notebook pressed against her chest like a shield. The merchant had remembered her pa had shaken his head and smiled and given her a fair price, throwing in an extra pound of seed for the memory of a man he'd called stubborn as bedrock and twice as honest. By the time she turned up the road to Daniel's ranch, her legs ached, her back was stiff, and her lips were cracked from sun and wind. The horse moved slow beneath her, as tired as she was. Daniel was waiting on the porch. He didn't speak when she dismounted, just took the horse's reins, led it to the water trough, and began unloading the sacks from where she'd tied them behind the saddle. His hands moved quick, efficient, but his eyes kept cutting back to her face. "Got enough for the North Field," Clara said. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw from days of silence and dust. "Merchant remembered my pa, gave me a fair price." Daniel hefted a sack onto his shoulder, 40 pounds, maybe 50. He carried it like it weighed nothing. "You look half dead. Feel it too." He set the sack down on the porch, turned to face her fully. His eyes moved over her, the dust coating her dress, the sunburn on her cheeks, the way she swayed slightly where she stood. "Rest today," he said. "We start planting tomorrow." Clara opened her mouth to argue, closed it. Her legs were shaking, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." She slept 14 hours straight. The planting began at dawn, before the sun could climb high enough to steal the moisture from the soil. Clara walked the rows with her father's notebook open in one hand, checking depths and spacing against his careful diagrams. Daniel followed with the seed bag, dropping kernels into the holes she had marked with a stick. "Deeper than corn," Clara called over her shoulder, "and closer together. The roots spread different." He adjusted without question. The work was brutal. Clara's hands, still tender from the journey, blistered on the second day and bled on the third. Her shoulders burned from bending. Her back ached in places she didn't know could ache. But she kept moving, kept planting, kept checking the notebook to make sure they were doing it right. Daniel worked beside her, silent and steady. He didn't complain about the pace she set, didn't question her methods, just planted where she told him to plant and dug where she told him to dig. On the 4th day, clouds gathered in the west. Clara saw them first dark shapes piling up along the horizon, heavy and low, blocking out the afternoon sun. She stopped in the middle of a row and shaded her eyes with her hand. "Could be nothing," Daniel said, coming up beside her. "We've had clouds before." "These are different." Clara pointed at the way they sat, weighted down by what they carried. "See how they're sitting. My pa used to say that's the kind that carries rain, real rain, not just spit and promises." They watched until the light began to fade. The clouds didn't move, just hung there like a held breath. The rain came at midnight. Clara woke to the sound of it, not the hard, violent drumming of a summer storm, but something gentler, a steady whisper against the roof, the walls, the parched earth outside. She lay in her narrow bed and listened, her heart beating slow, and even for the first time in weeks. By morning, the ground was dark with moisture. Water stood in puddles along the fence line. The rain barrels beside the house, empty for months, had filled to overflowing. Daniel walked the field at dawn. Clara watched from the porch, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. He moved slow, stopping every few feet to kneel and press his palm against the soil. When he came back, his boots were caked with mud, and his eyes were wet. "Ground's soaked through," he said. "6 inches down, maybe more." Clara nodded. She didn't trust her voice. The weeks that followed blurred together. June's brutal heat gave way to July's scorching afternoons, and Clara marked the days by the height of the crop. The sorghum sprouted on the 8th day, thin green shoots pushing up through dark soil, fragile as hope, stubborn as the woman who'd planted them. By the end of the 2nd week, the shoots had thickened into stalks. By Independence Day, they stood knee-high. By month's end, they reached her waist. More rain came. Not much, a few hours here, a morning there, but enough. The sorghum drank it in and kept growing. The corn in the other fields had long since died. Stalks, brown and brittle, collapsed against the ground, but the north field stayed green. August arrived, hot and dry, and still the sorghum held. The stalks grew thick as a man's thumb, their leaves broad and rustling, their heads beginning to form at the top. Clara walked the rows every morning, checking for pests, for disease, for any sign that the gamble wasn't paying off. She found none. The first neighbor to notice was old Emmett Dawson. Clara saw him pull up his horse at the edge of the property, staring at the north field with his mouth hanging open. She was on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl, and she watched him watch the sorghum for a full 5 minutes before he rode on without a word. The second time, he didn't just ride past. He turned up the drive, dismounted at the fence, and stood there with his hat in his hands until Daniel came out of the barn. "Carver." "Dawson." The old man shifted his weight. His eyes kept cutting toward the sorghum field, where the stalks now stood shoulder high, green and thick and impossibly alive. "That crop of yours," Dawson's voice came out grudging. "Where'd you learn to grow it?" Daniel wiped his hands on his trousers, took his time answering. "My wife taught me." Dawson's head swiveled toward the porch, where Clara sat with her bowl of peas, her fingers still moving even as her eyes met his. The old man's jaw worked sideways, like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he tipped his hat. Clara's hands went still. Dawson climbed back on his horse and rode away without another word. Clara watched him go, watched the dust rise behind his horse's hooves, watched until he was nothing but a speck on the road. "He tipped his hat to me," she said when Daniel came up the porch steps. "Saw that. First time anyone in this town done that." Daniel sat down in the chair beside her. His knee brushed against hers in accident. "Maybe. Or maybe not." "Won't be the last," he said. "Not if I got anything to say about it." September came, and the sorghum heads filled out, heavy with grain. Clara calculated the yield in her head, enough to pay the bank, enough to buy seed for next year, enough to prove that her father hadn't been wrong. But something else was happening too, something she didn't understand at first. The dizziness started in the mornings, a spinning sensation that came when she rose too fast from bed. She ignored it. Too much work to do. Too much riding on this harvest. She ate dry biscuits before rising and told herself it was nothing. Then came the nausea, the smell of coffee which had comforted her every morning, since she could remember now sent her stumbling for the door, hand pressed over her mouth. The smell of frying bacon was worse. She stopped cooking breakfast and blamed it on the heat. The fatigue settled into her bones and wouldn't leave. She slept 8 hours, 10 hours, and still woke, tired. Her breasts ached. Her back throbbed in a new and unfamiliar way. She hid it. There was too much at stake. Too much depending on her. Too much that could go wrong if she admitted weakness now. She worked through the dizziness, pushed through the nausea, ignored the exhaustion that dragged at her limbs. But Daniel noticed. "You ain't eating," he said one evening, watching her push beans around her plate. "Ain't hungry." "You've been saying that for a week." Clara set down her fork. "I'm fine, just tired." "You're pale as milk, and you've been running to the outhouse every morning before dawn." Daniel's eyes held hers. "I ain't blind, Clara, and I ain't stupid neither." Her hands trembled. She pressed them flat against the table. "It's the heat, or something I ate. It'll pass. Or maybe you ought to see Doc Reyes next time we're in town." The name landed like a stone in still water. Doc Reyes, the new doctor, the one who'd taken over after old Doc Hensley retired. The one who hadn't been there 8 years ago, when Hensley had looked at her and pronounced her barren as stone. "I don't need a doctor, Clara. I said I don't." The room tilted. Clara grabbed the edge of the table, her vision swimming, dark spots blooming at the edges. She heard Daniel's chair scrape back, felt his hand on her arm, and then she was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and no memory of how she'd gotten there. "That's it." Daniel's face swam into focus above her. "Tomorrow. We're going to town tomorrow." Clara opened her mouth to argue. The words wouldn't come. Her body felt strange, not sick exactly, but different. Changed in ways she couldn't name. "All right," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow." That night, she lay awake in her narrow bed, one hand pressed flat against her stomach. The strange sensation came again, faint, uncertain, deep in her belly, like wings, like flutter, like something small and new and impossible. She knew what she felt. The question was whether she dared believe it and what it would mean if the doctor in town confirmed what her body was already telling her. The sorghum stood head high by harvest time, the stalks thick and heavy with grain, their leaves rustling in the October wind like whispered prayers. 3 months had passed since Clara planted the first seed, 3 months of watching, waiting, praying in her own quiet way that her father's knowledge would prove true. It had. Clara walked between the rows, with a cutting knife in one hand, slicing stalks at the base, bundling them into sheaves that Daniel loaded onto the wagon. The sun beat down, gentler now than it had been in summer, but still warm enough to raise sweat on her brow. Her arms ached from the repetitive motion. Her back throbbed in that new, unfamiliar way that had become constant these past weeks. She was reaching for another stalk when the sky tilted sideways. The knife slipped from her fingers. She heard it hit the ground, heard Daniel shout her name, felt her knees buckle. Then there was dirt against her cheek, the smell of crushed sorghum leaves, the distant thunder of boots running toward her. Hands on her shoulders, her body being turned, lifted. Daniel's face above her, pale beneath his tan, his eyes wild. "Clara, Clara." She tried to speak. Her tongue felt thick, heavy. The world kept spinning. "I'm taking you to town," Daniel said. "Right now." She didn't argue. She couldn't. The wagon ride blurred into fragments, the creak of wheels, the jostle of ruts, Daniel's arm tight around her shoulders, holding her upright. By the time they reached Copper Creek, her head had cleared enough to walk. But Daniel half carried her up the stairs to Doc Reyes's office anyway. The examination room was small and clean, smelling of carbolic acid and something herbal Clara couldn't name. She sat on the examining table, while Dr. Reyes, younger than she'd expected, dark hair silvering at the temples. Hands that moved with careful precision checked her pulse. Her eyes, the color of her tongue. "How long have you been experiencing these symptoms?" His accent carried traces of somewhere south, Texas by way of Mexico. "Maybe a few weeks, maybe longer." Dizziness, nausea, fatigue. Clara nodded to each. The questions that followed were intimate, probing the same questions she'd answered once before, 8 years ago, in a different room with a different doctor and a different husband waiting by the door. She answered them all, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling. When she finished, Doc Reyes was quiet for a long moment. He crossed to a cabinet, pulled out a file of yellowed papers, and began reading. "These are records from Dr. Hensley's practice," he said. "I inherited them when I took over." He frowned at the handwriting. "Your name is here. Mrs. Carver. From 8 years ago." Clara's hands gripped the edge of the table. "Dr. Hensley noted that you were—" He paused. "That you were incapable of bearing children. He attributed it to a condition he claimed to have observed." The room felt small, the walls pressed in. Clara heard Daniel shift behind her, heard the creak of his boots on the wooden floor. "Mrs. Carver." Doc Reyes set down the file. His eyes met hers, and something in them made her breath catch not pity, but anger. Quiet, controlled anger. Dr. Hensley was not a careful man. His records are full of errors. Dosages miscalculated, symptoms misread. He shook his head. "I cannot say what he saw or didn't see 8 years ago. But I can tell you what I observed today." Clara stopped breathing. "You are not Barren, Mrs. Carver. You never were." The words hit her like a fist. Her ears filled with rushing water. Her hands went numb on the table's edge. "Say that again. You are pregnant. Approximately 3 months along. The child should arrive in early spring." "No." The word cracked in half. "No. That's not Dr. Hensley said." Dr. Hensley was wrong. The room tilted. Clara heard a sound strange, broken, animal, and realized it was coming from her own throat. Her vision blurred, her chest heaved. 8 years. 8 years of shame, of whispers, of believing she was broken, worthless, cursed, wrong, all of it wrong. She didn't remember Daniel crossing the room, just felt his arms around her, felt her face pressed against his chest, felt the sobs tearing out of her in great ugly waves. She cried until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until there was nothing left inside but a hollow, echoing space where the shame used to live. The ride home was quiet. Clara sat beside Daniel on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the road unspool before them. The sorghum fields passed on either side, golden and ready for harvest, but she barely saw them. Her mind kept circling back. 8 years. 8 years of carrying a lie someone else had told her about herself. 8 years of believing it. They were halfway home when she finally spoke. "I need to tell you something." Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. "All right. Not about the baby. Not yet." Clara turned to face him. "About me. about what I need you to understand before I say anything else." He waited. "When you came to my door that evening, I was ready to die." The words came out steady, though her chest ached with them. Not quick, I wasn't gonna do anything, but slow. Stop eating. Stop caring. Let the winter take me. She looked at her hands, at the calluses and the dirt and the thin gold band on her finger. I'd given up. Daniel's jaw tightened. You gave me a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to work, to plan for tomorrow instead of just waiting for it to end. Clara's voice cracked. That's worth more than anything Doc Reyes could tell me. Whatever happens, whatever comes next, I need you to know that. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I didn't marry you hoping for children. I married you because I was drowning, and you were the only person who didn't look at me like I was already dead. He shifted the reins to one hand, reached over, and covered her fingers with his. The baby's a blessing. Sure, but you're why I get up in the morning again. Clara's throat closed around the words she wanted to say. She leaned into him, and his arm came around her shoulders, and they rode the rest of the way home in silence. The harvest celebration came 2 weeks later, after the sorghum had been cut and bundled, and the first load sold to the grain merchant in town for enough money to pay the bank and buy seed for next year. Daniel had spread word that there would be food and music and company, and the neighbors came, the same neighbors who had whispered, who had turned away, who had called her cursed. They came because the sorghum harvest had been the only successful crop in the county, and maybe, Clara thought, they came because people wanted to believe that hard work and stubborn hope could still mean something. Emmett Dawson arrived with his wife, nodding to Clara as he passed. Mrs. Harmon came with a covered dish, her eyes not quite meeting Clara's, but not looking away either. The blacksmith came, and the new school teacher, and families Clara had never met, but who had heard the story of the Barren widow who had saved a dying ranch. Daniel found her as the sun was setting. He took her hand, her left hand, where the thin gold band still circled her finger, and led her to the center of the gathering. Most of you know my wife. His voice carried across the yard, rough and low. Some of you know what folks used to say about her. He stopped, swallowed hard. Clara could see the effort it took him to keep speaking. They were wrong, every word of it. He looked at her, then back at the crowd. She saved this place, and come spring, she's gonna be a mother. Silence. Then a murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara saw Mrs. Harmon's mouth fall open, saw Emmett Dawson's eyebrows climb toward his hat, saw faces she didn't know break into smiles. Someone started clapping, then another, then the whole gathering, applause rising into the evening air, mixing with the chirp of crickets and the smell of wood smoke and roasting corn. Clara stood in the center of it, Daniel's hand warm around hers, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the baby too early for that. Something else, something old and heavy finally letting go. Later, when the neighbors had gone and the dishes were washed and the kerosene lamps burned low, Clara sat on the porch beside Daniel. The night was cool, carrying the first real hint of autumn, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called its question. You scared? Daniel asked. Clara thought about the baby growing inside her, about the spring that would bring it into the world, about all the ways things could still go wrong. Terrified, she said, but the good kind, the kind that means something matters. Daniel's hand found hers in the darkness. Yeah, he said, the good kind. Above them, The stars wheeled slow across the Texas skyny, the sorghum fields stretched dark and empty now, ready for winter, ready for rest. And inside the small ranch house, a kerosene lamp burned in the window, a single point of light against the vast and endless night. Clara leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. His arm came around her, warm and solid and real. She didn't close her eyes. She wanted to see it all, the stars, the fields, the life she'd built from nothing but stubbornness and hope. She wanted to remember this moment, this feeling, this quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. For the first time in 8 years, Clara Carver believed she deserved to be happy. And she was. There's a quietness that settles after a story like this one. Not empty, but full in a way that doesn't ask for words. Something tender sits in the chest. Familiar as an old photograph found in a drawer you forgot you had. Many of us have carried names that weren't ours to carry. Some of us have waited years to be seen for who we actually are, not who others decided we should be. Perhaps you know what it feels like to love someone without knowing if they'll ever understand the weight of that love, or to be loved in return by someone who chose you before they had any reason to. These feelings don't need to be explained or wrapped up neatly. They're allowed to rest exactly where they are, unfinished and honest, the way most true things tend to be. A story doesn't have to answer every question it raises. Sometimes it's enough just to sit with what remains. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.